Some of you might be well aware of groundwater present. You would notice groundwater when you do things like dig a hole at the beach or even in your backyard, depending on how close the water is to the ground. So when the water in the ground gets too high, that's actually how we get flooding. So there's a couple different places where water can be found underground. Surface water is the water that collects on the surface of the planet, like water in rivers, lakes, and reservoirs. When there's precipitation, like snow and rain and sleet, much of it flows downhill as surface runoff. Some of it seeps below the ground. Groundwater is found under the Earth's surface. It's found in spaces in soil, sand, and rock. We get a lot of our drinking water from under the ground. Some of you that have well water that you drink from know this. You know that you get your water from a well, which is underground water. Now, groundwater is held in something called a watershed. So a watershed is an area of land in which all of the surface water and groundwater eventually flow into one body of water, like a river or a lake. Water is constantly flowing through a watershed. It moves from areas of higher elevation to lower elevation. So here are some of the different landforms that you've already looked at. A tributary, a river, it collects in groundwater, and eventually all of that water from the tributary, the river, and the groundwater pools in this lake. A watershed's boundaries are determined by the Earth's surface in that area. The physical features of the land, like ridges, hills, and mountains, help determine how and where the water will flow. It's like building a hill and then dumping a bucket of water on top of it and seeing that the water is going to run down the side of the hill. A watershed divide is an imaginary line that separates two neighboring watersheds. Tributaries, which you might have remember from our landform discussion, are small rivers, creeks, and streams that flow into larger rivers called tributaries. Each has its own watershed called the local watershed. This means that a larger watershed is made up of many smaller watersheds. So there are watersheds all over the United States. Below you'll see a map of where the different watersheds are. So wherever you are in a watershed. There is always water underground. It can be as small as a creek or big enough to cover several states. Each one is usually named after the body of water into which it flows. So we are part of the Great Lakes watershed because eventually all of the water that flows into the ground and through the earth is going to end up in the Great Lakes. Here in Wisconsin, we have a couple different watersheds. Us in Green Bay, we live in the Lake Michigan Basin. So you can see all these little rivers and underground groundwater. They are all part of the Lake Michigan Basin that eventually flow into Lake Michigan. We also, on the opposite side of the state, have the Mississippi River. So that means that all the water past that dark line in the green area is going to flow towards the Mississippi River. In the very northern part of Wisconsin, we have the Lake Superior Basin. That means that at that very tip, all the water underground in rivers, in lakes, eventually ends up in Lake Superior, which you can see on the map on the right, that tip of Wisconsin is bordering Lake Superior. So when we build to make a social studies connection, when humans created settlements, it was really important that they were by water, which is why the Green Bay area was a really important place to build a city because there was access to water. We use water for transportation, waste disposal, food. We use water all the time. So we need water that's drinkable. We use it for recreation, like being able to fish and swim, and we want it to look pretty. Now, there are a couple pictures I'm going to show you. That just goes with what I was just talking about. So as we look at the land, we have different levels of elevation. We have different levels of hills. And this area, this dark line, that's the water table. So that means that's where the water is in the ground. So if I dig a hole down to that level, I am going to start to see water. Now, it's not a big, giant lake underground. It's actually water that's in between the rocks and the soil. Now, in this picture, we have hills on either side of the river, and you can see that when water evaporates from the ground and then is precipitated, it rains, that water is going to eventually flow down these little hills and into this river here. Okay, so here it is again. Here's a dissection of it. Here's the water table. So there's all this groundwater, and underground still the water is flowing from high level of elevation to low level of elevation, and eventually it all gets pulled back into our river. Okay, when there's more rain, like we've had really recently, some of you might know about the flooding, when we have more rain, that water table gets higher and higher. And when the water table reaches the ground level where we are, that's when we get flooding. Okay, so we get more infiltration, the groundwater level rises, we're going to have more water. You can see, I'm going to go back. If the water table rises, our rivers and our lakes are going to get bigger because there's more water at the surface of the land. Now, if you want to see different pictures of these basins and tributaries, I'm going to link some interactive maps. So here's a map of all of the different tributaries connected. So all the rivers that are connected. So here's the Mississippi River that runs into the Gulf of Mexico, runs all the way up north, and it's the border of Wisconsin. And then we also have the Wisconsin River. Okay. Here's the Fox River. Lots of you live by the Fox River. Okay. Another map is going to be on this website, and here again are all of the watersheds in the United States. Okay, the green one is the Lake Michigan Basin. Then we have the pink, which is the Mississippi River Basin. And at the very top, okay, here's Wisconsin, we again have the Lake Superior Basin. Then you can look at the separate states and countries as well, the different watersheds in those areas.